Hello, welcome to RTV 115, Introduction to Broadcasting. This is the first video lecture for the History Unit, which is Week 1's unit. And we're going to cover mostly in this lecture the start of radio. Now, we're actually going to go a little bit further back than the invention of the radio with the invention of the penny press, which is in the 1830s. Okay, now this was a cheap kind of tabloid / newspaper that was mass-produced at a reasonable price and was affordable to the common man. So thereby it created a mass audience, which is pretty important. You can't have mass media without mass audience. First example was the New York Sun. Again, it was founded in the 1830s. Likewise, the phonograph also helped create that mass audience, which is a crucial ingredient you're going to need for the success of radio and later TV, cable, etc. So the phonograph provided entertainment in the home and created popular demand for recorded music. And then later we had, of course, motion pictures in the 1920s. We'll get into that a little bit later, but motion pictures laid the groundwork for television. What else set the stage for radio? Well, the invention of the telegraph, again, 1800s invention. 1844, Samuel Morse found a way to send electronic signals by way of wire. Okay, and this invention, as well as the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, sent voice information over wires. So you have the ability to send, you have a mass audience created by the penny press and the phonograph. Then you have the ability to send information over wires with the telegraph and voice over wires with the telephone. So these ingredients, we're kind of mixing them together, and later on we're going to use them in radio. And radio would combine all these elements with wireless transmission in the 1920s. Okay, what else set the stage for radio? Well, some groundbreaking work by some scientists in the late 1800s. Maxwell in 73 theorized that electromagnetic energy existed. He proved the math, and then Hertz came along in 88 and proved Maxwell's theory with an actual experiment. Now, they did the science, and this gentleman, Marconi, actually put an application to it. He developed the wireless radio in 1896. Now, some say that Tesla actually deserves credit for a creation of the wireless, but Marconi defended his assertions in court. Now, the vacuum tube came along in 1906, and with it, DeForest invented what was known as the audion. Now, this allowed for the amplification of sound. And again, there's some disputes. Some historians say it was somebody else. We're going to go with, for our purposes, DeForest. The first commercial uses of the wireless technology was with seagoing ships, and they would send basically telegraph signals over the wireless technology. So we're not yet sending audio over the air. Right now, we're just sending electronic signals over the air. We're getting to radio, though. A dramatic example, of course, of the telegraph signals being sent over the wireless was the rescue of the SOS call, the Titanic, in 1912. Now we're getting to radio as we know it. The first instance of radio and voice transmission was by Reginald Fessenden in 1906. And so wireless radio was being used mostly still in just to send telegraph signals. And in World War I, the U.S. Navy actually took over control of the technology, of the wireless technology, so that different companies wouldn't be working at cross purposes, and the wireless technology could be used to coordinate the war effort. After the war, U.S. Congress told the Navy, okay, it's time to let go of control of this technology, and it reverted back to private ownership. And from this point on, U.S. radio and TV would actually remain under private control, although the government still does have a vested interest in regulating it. First radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh, There was a station in Canada that came on at roughly the same time, so there's a little bit of dispute there as to which one's the first, but we're going to go with KDKA for our purposes. And it was kind of founded by Westinghouse, and a gentleman named Dr. Frank Conrad was one of their engineers, one of the company engineers. They made electronic components. And he began experimenting with broadcasting in 1919. And Westinghouse went along and said, okay, well, we need a way to, because they started building radio sets, and they said, well, we need people to buy our radio sets. What better way than to found our own radio station? And so the first broadcast of KDKA, which was founded by Westinghouse, was in 1920, and it was actually coverage of the presidential election. Commercials came pretty soon at the beginning of radio. We actually escaped it for a couple years because, believe it or not, they were actually kind of considered scandalous beginning in the early years of radio broadcasting. That didn't last very long. WEAF in New York City actually aired the first commercial in 1922. They had what they called back then toll broadcasting, which they had an advertiser, allowed them 10 minutes to promote whatever product they had. Indirect advertising allowed the advertiser's name to be attached to the program. And it took really until 1928 for the industry to finally start advertising in kind of the traditional sense. Network broadcasting came along with the appearance of the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, which was actually originally American Marconi. Now they spun off and actually founded NBC in 1926, which was the first radio network. They had red and blue networks. The red ones were kind of more prominent, and the blue networks were a little weaker stations and didn't have as much coverage. And then quickly following, CBS came on the scene in 1927. Government regulation was sort of inevitable in the industry. The 1912 Radio Act actually covered more, focused more on wireless radio telegraphy, which again was not sound sent over the air so much as electronic signals. Well, the 1912 Act didn't really account for radio broadcasting's growth. And so it wasn't really adequate enough to control the growth and anticipate the growth of radio broadcasting. So the industry actually asked the government to step in, and Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover at the time was very reluctant. He thought the industry should really regulate itself, but unfortunately in the industry nobody could agree on standards, how things should be regulated, and so really it came down to the government was the only one who could do it. In 1927 was a more substantial radio act. It established the Federal Radio Commission. It defined AM radio, and we'll talk about FM a little bit later. And it said, importantly, that broadcasting must serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And that would be a tenet that would be used throughout government regulation of any broadcast medium. Again, public interest, convenience, and necessity. And then lastly, we're going to just briefly touch on radio and the Depression. It was kind of a welcome distraction, of course, from what was a really dark time. Families would kind of gather around the radio set in the home, and again, it was kind of a welcome distraction from the grim reality of what the Depression was. And FDR was the first president to really utilize radio in a very effective manner with his fireside chats. There had been earlier presidents that had used it, but not to the extent that FDR did. And he kind of honed it as his own personal tool to interface with his constituents and kind of offer them encouragement in a really dark time. And it became, because of his precedence, it became necessary for later political figures to use radio and then later TV, etc., as a means to effectively communicate and have a presence among their constituents. That's it for the first lecture. I'll see you on the next one.